When the old Ford in Mrs. Jensen's field became a shelter for a stray dog, the neighborhood didn't think much of it. The dog, fierce yet protective, barked at anyone who dared approach. The persistent whining one chilly evening, however, prompted a concerned call to the local police, drawing them to the mysterious vehicle. The officers' faces turned pale as they cautiously opened the car door, revealing something unexpected. Mrs. Jensen had left the old Ford where her late husband had last parked it in the field just hours before he passed. She'd walked through the field every day, until one day she noticed a stray dog had made a shelter out of it. Despite its hostility, some neighbors left food nearby, feeling a sense of pity. No one imagined the secret the vehicle held within its rusted doors. One evening, the dog's persistent whining echoed through the quiet field. Concerned, Mrs. Jensen called the local police, worried the dog might be in pain. Officers Martinez and Brown arrived shortly after, flashlights in hand, approaching the old Ford with caution. The dog's barks and whines grew more frantic as they neared. "Easy now," Officer Martinez murmured, his voice steady. "It's okay, baby." "Shh," he cooed, trying to calm down the distressed animal. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and her stance was protective, but it didn't attack. Officer Brown reached for the door handle. It was too dark to see properly inside the car. They'd have to get closer to find out whatever lay inside. With a soft click, the door creaked open. Officer Brown shined his flashlight into the car, revealing a tangle of blankets on the back seat. The flashlights flickered over the scene, revealing a small, trembling form. It took a moment for the officers to realize it was a baby, crying softly and shivering in the cold. Officer Martinez quickly called for medical assistance through her dispatch radio, while Brown carefully lifted the baby out of the car. The dog stopped barking, watching intently as if ensuring the child's safety. The baby's cry pierced through the silence of the night, sending a shiver down the officers' backs. As the ambulance arrived, the neighbors quickly gathered in the field. Awoken by the cries of the baby, their whispers of concern now rippled through the crowd. Who could have left a baby in such a state, and in late Mr. Jensen's old Ford, nonetheless? Despite the crowd, the dog remained vigilant and silent beside Officer Brown, keeping its eyes on the baby in his arms. Mrs. Jensen, who had been watching from her porch with a deep frown etched on her face, slowly walked towards the commotion. She had lived here for decades and knew every family's story. This was something she'd never witnessed before, something heartbreaking. She couldn't shake the feeling that she held a sort of responsibility. The baby, now safe in the care of paramedics, was taken to the hospital for further examination. Officer Martinez turned his attention back to the car, searching for any clues or evidence. Amidst the blankets, he found a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and eyes missing, as well as a worn picture of a young woman. He asked Mrs. Jensen if she recognized her, but she didn't. "We need to find out whose baby this is," Brown said, his voice firm. Martinez nodded, his gaze scanning the small crowd still huddled around the old Ford. The expressions on their faces were a mix of fear and curiosity, but nobody came forward with any answers. The investigation had only just begun, but the officers were determined to get to the bottom of this. The next morning, the story was all over the local news. Reporters speculated on the baby's identity and the mysterious circumstances. As more officers joined the search for the child's parents, the town's sense of unease grew. Everyone had a theory, but no one had the truth. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jensen woke up to find the stray dog waiting for her on her porch. The same dog that had barked at everyone now sat quietly, its eyes fixed on her door. She paused, her heart heavy with the memory of last night's events. Why was the dog here now, after all that had happened? She felt a strange connection, a silent understanding passing between them. When Mrs. Jensen opened the door, the dog trotted up to her, tail wagging slightly. It seemed to be searching for something, its nose sniffing the air and then her feet. "What is it, girl?" Mrs. Jensen asked softly. The dog looked up at her with pleading eyes, a quiet whine escaping its throat. She felt an urge to understand, to help the creature that had guarded the baby. Realizing the dog was looking for the baby, Mrs. Jensen bent down, letting the dog sniff her hand before petting it softly. "You're looking for the baby, aren't you?" she whispered. The dog's tail thumped once against the porch, as if in agreement. Mrs. Jensen's heart ached at the sight. She had never seen such loyalty from an animal before. She knew she had to do something. She told the dog in a gentle voice that she didn't have the baby, and the dog whined in reply, understanding her words. "I'm sorry, but the baby's at the hospital," she explained. The dog's ears perked up and it whined again, nudging her leg with its nose. Mrs. Jensen sighed, feeling the weight of the situation. "We'll go see the baby," she promised, patting the dog's head. Mrs. Jensen called the police for updates, found none, and decided to visit the baby at the hospital, leading the dog on a makeshift leash. She tied a piece of old rope gently around the dog's neck. "Come on, let's go," she said. The dog followed her obediently, its steps light and eager. They walked down the path together, united by their concern for the little one. On her walk, several people stopped Mrs. Jensen to ask for news about the baby, surprised to see her with the calm dog. "Is that the same dog from the field?" Mr. Thompson asked, eyebrows raised. Mrs. Jensen nodded, a small smile forming. "Yes, it's the same one. We're on our way to the hospital," she replied. The dog stayed close, watching the curious faces. The dog remained docile next to Mrs. Jensen, barking a warning when others tried to pet it. "Easy, girl," Mrs. Jensen murmured, keeping a firm grip on the makeshift leash. "She's a bit protective," she explained to the curious onlookers. The dog's eyes never left her side, its loyalty evident in every step. People nodded understandingly, giving them space as they continued their walk. Mrs. Jensen took much longer to reach the hospital, being stopped frequently by concerned townspeople. "How's the baby doing?" Mrs. Clark asked, worry etched on her face. "We're about to find out," Mrs. Jensen responded, her pace steady. The dog trotted beside her, patient but alert. Each interaction slowed them down, but Mrs. Jensen didn't mind, appreciating the town's concern for the child. Finally arriving, Mrs. Jensen greeted the receptionist, who noted the dog's unusual behavior. "You brought a dog?" the receptionist asked, glancing at the calm animal. Mrs. Jensen nodded. "She's been with the baby since we found her," she explained. The receptionist looked intrigued, but nodded, understanding the situation. "Wait here a moment," she said, preparing to make a call. The dog sat quietly at Mrs. Jensen's feet. Mrs. Jensen reassured the dog before heading inside, promising to be back soon. "You stay here, okay? I'll be back before you know it," she whispered, giving the dog a gentle pat. The dog's eyes were filled with trust as it watched her go. Mrs. Jensen took a deep breath and stepped into the hospital, ready to find out how the baby was doing. The receptionist informed Mrs. Jensen that dogs weren't allowed inside the hospital. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't bring the dog in here," she said, looking apologetic. Mrs. Jensen sighed and nodded, understanding the rules. "I'll find a way to keep her outside," she replied. The dog, sensing something was up, looked between the two women with curious eyes. Mrs. Jensen whispered to the dog, asking it to wait outside, and the dog obediently sat at the entrance. "Stay here, girl. I'll be back soon," she murmured, giving the dog a reassuring pat. The dog sat down, its eyes following her every move. Mrs. Jensen gave one last glance before stepping inside, feeling a mix of worry and determination. The receptionist, stunned by the dog's behavior, directed Mrs. Jensen to the children's ward. "Your dog is very well behaved," she remarked, still surprised. Mrs. Jensen smiled. "She's special," she replied simply. The receptionist nodded and pointed down the hallway. "The children's ward is this way. You'll find the baby there." Mrs. Jensen thanked her and started walking, her heart beating faster with each step. Mrs. Jensen greeted the nurse, who recognized her from the previous evening. "Mrs. Jensen, it's good to see you again," the nurse said with a warm smile. "How's the baby?" Mrs. Jensen asked, her voice full of concern. "She's doing much better," the nurse replied. "Follow me and I'll take you to her." Mrs. Jensen felt a wave of relief wash over her. Following the nurse, Mrs. Jensen made her way to see the baby. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, each step filled with anticipation. "She's right in here," the nurse said, opening a door to a small, cozy room. Mrs. Jensen took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the tiny figure lying in the cot. Her heart swelled with emotion. Mrs. Jensen walked up to the small cot where the baby was placed, tracing a finger over the baby's cheek. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny hands curling into fists. Mrs. Jensen smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her heart. "You're safe now," she whispered softly. The baby's eyes fluttered open for a moment, then closed again, her breathing steady and calm. The nurse informed her that the baby was a girl, but that they hadn't found the mother yet. "We're doing everything we can to locate her family," the nurse explained. Mrs. Jensen nodded, her concern deepening. "Thank you for taking care of her," she said. The nurse smiled warmly. "She's a strong little one," she replied, adjusting the baby's blanket gently. Mrs. Jensen asked if she could give the baby a temporary name, and the nurse agreed. "Of course, that would be fine," the nurse said. Mrs. Jensen thought for a moment, her mind racing through memories. "It feels right to give her a name, even if it's just for now," she said softly. The nurse nodded, understanding the importance of the gesture. She decided to name the baby Anna, after her late sister, and held her cradled to her chest. "Hello, Anna," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. The baby snuggled closer, her tiny fingers gripping Mrs. Jensen's shirt. "You remind me so much of her," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. She felt a deep connection, a bond forming in that moment. Mrs. Jensen promised to visit the next day and walked back out, finding the dog patiently waiting for her. "I'll be back soon, Anna," she whispered before leaving the room. As she stepped outside, the dog's tail wagged and it stood up eagerly. "Let's go home, girl," Mrs. Jensen said, smiling. They walked together, the bond between them growing stronger with each step. Officers Brown and Martinez greeted Mrs. Jensen and the dog when she returned home. "Mrs. Jensen, glad to see you," Officer Brown said with a nod. The dog barked once, its tail wagging slightly. "Everything all right?" Officer Martinez asked, noticing the tired look on Mrs. Jensen's face. "Yes, we just visited the baby at the hospital," she replied, giving the officers a weary smile. Mrs. Jensen explained that the dog seemed concerned about the baby and had been waiting for her. "She's been by my side since we found the baby," she said. Officer Brown glanced at the dog, who sat obediently at Mrs. Jensen's feet. "That's incredible," he remarked. "Dogs have a way of sensing things," Mrs. Jensen added, patting the dog's head. "She's been a true guardian." The officers mentioned they were investigating items found near the baby, using the picture as a lead. "We're looking into the photograph and the teddy bear," Officer Martinez explained, holding up the worn picture. "It might give us some clues about the mother." Mrs. Jensen nodded, her expression hopeful. "I hope you find something," she said, glancing at the dog for reassurance. Mrs. Jensen shared that they named the baby Anna, expressing her hope of finding the mother soon. "We decided to call her Anna, after my sister," she said softly. Officer Brown smiled. "That's a beautiful name," he replied. "Thank you," Mrs. Jensen said. "I just want her to be safe and find her family." The officers nodded, sharing her concern and determination. Officer Martinez explained their search efforts around town, showing the picture to residents. "We're talking to everyone, hoping someone recognizes her," he said. Mrs. Jensen listened intently, appreciating their dedication. "I'll keep my eyes and ears open too," she offered. "Thank you, Mrs. Jensen," Officer Martinez replied. The dog barked softly, as if understanding their conversation, and they all shared a moment of silent determination. The officers searched the old fort again in daylight, looking for any missed clues. "Let's see if we can find anything new," Officer Brown said, peering inside the car. Martinez nodded, carefully inspecting the back seat. The sunlight revealed more details, but nothing seemed out of place. No signs of struggle, Martinez noted, just the baby's things. They searched thoroughly, hoping for a breakthrough. Officer Martinez expressed his concern about the case to Officer Brown, noting something didn't add up. "It's strange, isn't it?" Martinez said, shaking his head. "Why leave a baby in an old car, but make sure she's safe?" Brown agreed, frowning. "Yeah, it's like they wanted her found." They both felt the weight of unanswered questions, their curiosity growing with each passing moment. Martinez found it odd that someone would leave a baby with care items in a safe place. "There's food, blankets, even a toy," he pointed out, holding up the worn teddy bear. This wasn't a careless act. Brown nodded, looking thoughtful. It's like someone cared enough to ensure she'd be all right. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit, and the officers felt a deeper mystery at play. Officer Brown asked if Martinez thought the baby wasn't abandoned willingly, and Martinez agreed. "Maybe something happened to the mother," Martinez suggested. Brown's eyes narrowed. "You think she was in danger?" Martinez shrugged. "It's possible. We need to consider all angles." They both sensed there was more to the story, their determination to uncover the truth growing stronger. They left the scene, still puzzled by the circumstances surrounding the baby's abandonment. "We're missing something," Brown muttered as they walked away from the Ford. Martinez nodded in agreement. "We'll keep digging," he said firmly. The mystery weighed heavily on their minds, the image of the baby and the old car lingering. They knew the answers wouldn't come easily, but they were committed to finding them. The investigation stalled, with no one recognizing the picture or the teddy bear. Officers Martinez and Brown had knocked on countless doors, but each lead ended in disappointment. "Nobody knows anything," Brown said, frustration evident in his voice. Martinez sighed. "We need a break, something to point us in the right direction." The weight of the mystery hung over them, each day adding to their uncertainty. Officers Martinez and Brown returned to Mrs. Jensen's house, now with a dog named Luna. "Good to see you again," Mrs. Jensen greeted them warmly. Luna, sitting by the porch, wagged her tail. "Hey, Luna," Martinez said, kneeling down. The dog's eyes were watchful but calm. "We've been working on her trust," Mrs. Jensen explained. "She's come a long way since that night." Luna allowed Officer Martinez to pet her briefly, surprising him. "Well, look at that," Martinez said with a grin, gently patting Luna's head. The dog didn't pull away, her tail wagging slightly. "You're a good girl, aren't you?" he murmured. Mrs. Jensen smiled. "She's learning to trust others, one step at a time." It was a small but hopeful sign in their ongoing challenge. Mrs. Jensen shared that they were working on Luna's trust in other humans. "It's taken patience, but she's getting there," Mrs. Jensen said. "She's protective by nature, but she's starting to see that not everyone is a threat." Martinez nodded, watching Luna settle down comfortably. "She's been through a lot," he remarked, "but she's strong." The bond between Luna and Mrs. Jensen was clear and strong. The officers admitted they were stuck in their search for Anna's mother as Luna started whining at the door. "We're hitting dead ends," Brown confessed. "No one recognizes the picture or the bear." Mrs. Jensen frowned, feeling the frustration. "We'll keep trying," she said firmly. Just then, Luna whined again, pawing at the door. "What is it, girl?" Mrs. Jensen asked, sensing Luna's urgency. Luna scratched and pawed at the front door, prompting Mrs. Jensen and the officers to investigate. "What's got her so worked up?" Officer Brown wondered aloud. Mrs. Jensen opened the door, and Luna bolted outside, barking urgently. "Follow her," Martinez said, hurrying after the dog. The urgency in Luna's actions was unmistakable, and they all felt a surge of anticipation as they followed her lead. The dog bolted outside, leading them to the edge of the path and a fence. Luna stopped briefly, looking back to ensure they were following, then continued on, her nose to the ground. "Where's she taking us?" Mrs. Jensen asked, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Let's find out," Brown replied, climbing over the fence. They all moved quickly, spurred on by Luna's determination. Officers and Mrs. Jensen followed Luna into the forest past the old Ford. The car stood silently, a stark reminder of where they had found Anna. Luna didn't pause, leading them deeper into the woods. "She's onto something," Martinez said, his flashlight cutting through the dense trees. Mrs. Jensen stayed close, her heart pounding with each step. The forest seemed to close in around them. Despite their calls, Luna kept moving, leading them deeper into the forest. "Luna, wait!" Mrs. Jensen called, but the dog didn't slow down. "She's determined," Brown said, pushing through the underbrush. Martinez nodded, focusing on keeping up. The night air grew cooler as they ventured further, the trees whispering secrets as they passed. Luna's urgency pushed them onward, curiosity and concern driving their steps. They finally reached another fence, marking the edge of the shadier part of town. Luna stopped and barked, waiting for them to catch up. "What's over there?" Martinez wondered, eyeing the fence. "It's the rougher part of town," Mrs. Jensen said, her voice uneasy. The fence loomed tall and imposing, separating them from what lay beyond. They exchanged glances, the mystery deepening with each moment. Luna waited by the fence, and Officer Martinez hesitantly opened it. "All right, girl, show us the way," he said, pushing the gate aside. Luna slipped through immediately, her movements quick and determined. Mrs. Jensen and Officer Brown followed closely, the tension rising. "This better lead somewhere," Brown muttered, glancing around. Martinez nodded, his focus on the dog's path. The fence creaked shut behind them. The dog slipped inside a shady-looking building, barking and whining. "What's she found?" Mrs. Jensen wondered aloud, her voice tinged with worry. The building looked abandoned, its windows broken and walls covered in grime. Luna's barking grew more urgent, echoing inside. "We need to be careful," Martinez said, approaching the entrance cautiously. Brown nodded, drawing his flashlight. The situation felt more precarious with each step. Officers Martinez and Brown decided to call for backup before entering. "We can't go in alone," Martinez said, pulling out his radio. Brown agreed, scanning the area for any signs of danger. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. Martinez radioed for additional units, explaining the situation. "We'll wait here," he said, keeping a close eye on the building. Luna's barking continued, relentless and insistent. They waited with Mrs. Jensen, who believed Luna was leading them for a reason. "She knows something," Mrs. Jensen said firmly. Brown nodded, though his expression was skeptical. "I hope you're right," he replied. The minutes ticked by slowly, the night growing colder. Luna's barking seemed to echo their impatience, each sound heightening their anticipation. "Hang tight, girl," Martinez murmured, anxious for backup to arrive. Backup arrived, and a female officer named Jane stayed with Mrs. Jensen as the officers entered. "We've got this," Jane reassured Mrs. Jensen, giving her a comforting smile. Martinez and Brown moved toward the entrance, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Luna quieted down, sensing the change. "Be careful," Mrs. Jensen called softly. "We will," Martinez replied, stepping into the building. The air inside felt heavy with secrets. Inside, the building was dark and smelled awful, with dirty mattresses and empty containers scattered about. "What a mess," Officer Brown muttered, his flashlight revealing the squalor. Martinez nodded, covering his nose. "Stay close," he advised. They carefully stepped over debris, the sound of Luna's barking guiding them. Each step brought them closer to the source, their determination cutting through the filth and darkness. Officers followed Luna's barking to the third floor, finding a sick young woman on a filthy mattress. "Over here!" Martinez called, his voice urgent. The woman looked up weakly, her eyes dull with illness. Luna sat beside her, whining softly. "Ma'am, we're here to help," Brown said gently. The woman tried to sit up, her movements sluggish and pained. Martinez knelt beside her, offering support. Officer Brown called for medical assistance as they helped the woman up. "We need an ambulance. 3rd floor," he reported into his radio. Martinez supported the woman who leaned heavily on him. "You're going to be okay," he reassured her. The woman nodded weakly, her breath labored. "Let's get you out of here," Brown said, guiding them toward the stairs. The situation felt critical. The woman asked about her baby, and the officers reassured her that Anna was safe. "My baby? Where's my baby?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's safe," Martinez said softly. "We found her, and she's being taken care of." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. "Thank you," she breathed. The officers shared a relieved glance, knowing they had given her a glimmer of hope. They quickly moved her into an ambulance and headed to the hospital. The paramedics worked swiftly, checking her vital signs. "Hang in there," Brown said, his voice steady. Martinez nodded, holding her hand. "We're with you," he said. The ambulance doors closed and the siren wailed as they sped away. Luna watched them go, her mission seemingly complete. The officers felt a surge of relief. Officers Martinez and Brown informed Mrs. Jensen about finding Anna's mother, Jenny. "We found her in a bad state, but she's safe now," Martinez said. Mrs. Jensen's eyes widened with relief. "Thank goodness," she replied. Luna wagged her tail, sensing the good news. "She's being taken to the hospital," Brown added. Mrs. Jensen nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. "We should go there too," she said. Mrs. Jensen and Luna followed the ambulance to the hospital. "Come on, Luna," she called, and the dog trotted beside her. The ride felt long, the anticipation growing. At the hospital, they quickly found their way to the emergency room. "We're here to see Jenny," Mrs. Jensen told the receptionist. Luna sat quietly, her presence a calming force. The receptionist nodded, directing them to Jenny's room. Jenny, homeless and sick, explained her reasons for leaving Anna in a safe place. "I couldn't take care of her out there," Jenny said, her voice weak. "I knew she'd be found in the car." Mrs. Jensen listened, her heart aching for the young mother. "You did what you thought was best," she reassured Jenny. Tears streamed down Jenny's face as she nodded, grateful for the understanding. Jenny recognized Mrs. Jensen from her volunteer work, hoping she'd take care of her baby. "I've seen you at the shelter," Jenny said, a small smile forming. Mrs. Jensen was surprised. "You remembered me?" she asked. Jenny nodded. "I knew you were kind, and I hoped you'd find Anna." Mrs. Jensen felt a deep connection forming. "I'll help you both," she promised, her voice firm and caring. After weeks of recovery, Jenny moved in with Mrs. Jensen, baby Anna, and Luna, forming a new family. The house was filled with warmth and laughter. "Welcome home," Mrs. Jensen said, hugging Jenny. Anna giggled in her arms, and Luna barked happily. "Thank you for everything," Jenny whispered, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "We're a family now," Mrs. Jensen replied, smiling. Together, they began a new chapter, united by love and hope.